morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our class this morning. Welcome to the faithful few who made it through the stormy, snowy weather to be here. We're glad you're here. Welcome to those of you who are watching us online. We're glad to have you join us as well. We have two of our young people to start us today, so we'll let them go. Give them your name and your passage.
Hi, my name's Luke, and I'll be reading Philippians 4, verse 6. Philippians 4, verse 6 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but come to me in prayer." I like this verse because it shows me not to be anxious and that I have to pray to God for all my problems. I see in this verse that I have to trust in God's plan. Please pray with me. Lord, please help us not to be anxious about anything, instead to focus on you and your word. Lord, please help us to trust in you. Amen.
Hi, I'm Izzy. The verse I chose was 2 Corinthians 5, verse 13. It says, "And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him, who for their sake died and was raised." I like this verse because it's telling me that Jesus died for everyone. God does not exclude anyone in his kingdom. I see in this verse that when I go with God, I put my life down for him. He died for me, and I can devote myself to him. Please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, you love each and every one of us. You love us all so much, and you want us to be with you. I pray that we can devote ourselves to you. Please help us to give all of the glory to you and you only. In your heavenly name I pray. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to hand the mic to somebody else there. Okay.
Morning, everyone. Everyone? Sunday, December 1st, I believe that's the first week of Advent. We will be having another coffee hour to benefit the 2025 Our Redeemer VBS program. With as many people that are here today, unfortunately, I won't get an opportunity next week to get a second chance. So if you're thinking that you could make some bakery for that coffee hour, it would be much appreciated. If you do want to make bakery and you would like a reminder, just put your phone number behind your name and I will give you a call the day after Thanksgiving to remind you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. Okay. For those of you who have asked, a number of you have, I am better. I am not 100% yet, but I'm better. I still have this nagging cough, so if I break into a cough again, I'm sorry about that. Pastor Heckert made me a nice little iced tea, not ice, hot tea. Put a little something in it. I'm not sure what, but it's helpful. Some honey and I don't know, something else. So, for our, let's see, gotta turn this on. Here we go. It's easy to get the words confused. To go to the concession stand or the confession stand, whichever. Yeah, there you are. The trouble with quotes on the internet is that it's difficult to determine whether or not they are genuine. So says Abraham Lincoln. You believe that, don't you, Jim? Whatever. Okay, and then finally, this is my motto in life. It's better to grow old with a sense of humor than to grow old with no sense at all. And that's true. Okay. Oh, there it is. Good morning, Judy. A little sip of tea. And let's begin with prayer. Thank you, Lord, for the day, for the opportunity to continue our study of the book of Nehemiah. May your word through him bless us as we serve you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, last week in our abortive attempt to try and have a class, we ended at the end of chapter 9. We looked at the long prayer in chapter 9 where they recounted their Israel's history and their relationship with God, and that God continually accepts them, forgives them, restores them. And so we got a pretty good idea of that. And then they ended that chapter with a solemn agreement. And chapters 10 and 11 kind of spell out a little bit of what that agreement is really all about. And so we'll take a look at that. Linda, I'm not going to have you read the first 29 chapters of chapter 10 because it's just all names. But let me just tell you what it says, what it's all about. The names, it's the names of those who signed or sealed their name on the solemn agreement. The first names in the first verse are Nehemiah, the governor, and Zedekiah, a scribe. The scribe who probably wrote the agreement that they all signed. Then there's a list of priests in verses 2 through 8. 9 through 13 is a list of Levites. Then the lay leaders are listed, and then the rest of the people. They all bound themselves. The rest of the people didn't sign the oath, but they took a curse upon themselves and an oath that if they broke it, the curse would apply to them. And they all vowed to obey carefully the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord. That's what they vowed to do. Now, here are the stipulations, and here we're going to have you read from verse 30 down through verse 39.
We promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us or take their daughters for our sons. When the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. Every 7th year we will forego working the land and will cancel all debts. We assume the responsibility for carrying out the commands to give 1/3 of a shekel each year for the service of the house of our God. For the bread set out on the table, for the regular grain offerings and burnt offerings, for the offerings on the Sabbaths, new moon festivals, and appointed feasts, for the holy offerings, for sin offerings to make atonement for Israel, and for all the duties of the house of our God.
All right, let's just stop. We're going to break this into the sections. The first stipulation, the first category, was verse 30 was an agreement not to intermarry. And that was an ongoing issue back to Ezra's time, and it still is an ongoing. But they vow not to give their daughters in marriage, and it'll reoccur again in the next couple of chapters. But that was the first stipulation. The second one had to do with honoring the Sabbath, and that is to pay attention to whoops, that's not what I want. That's what I want there. The times in the life of the Israelites were marked by 2 cycles of 7. The 7th day was the Sabbath day, that was a day of rest. And the 7th year, the sabbatical year, came at the end of a cycle of 7 years. And so they vowed that they would adhere to those things. The Sabbath year was an interesting thing. It would actually have provided somewhat of a hardship because they planted no crops during that year. Now, for those of you who are familiar with farming, letting a field lie fallow is a good thing. every once in a while. Just let it rejuvenate on its own. And so that was a good thing, and having a person rest is a good thing. But if you had no crops for the year, you had no income. And so it was a tough time, but they did it faithfully every 7 years. And then let's read on verse 32. Or did you read that already? No, okay, 32.
No, I read that already.
You did, okay.
We're down.
That's right. I'm sorry. And the third, they carried out provided for the annual support of the temple, an annual temple tax of a third shekel. We see that temple tax still evident in the New Testament when they asked Jesus to pay the temple tax, and he tells Peter to get a fish out of the Sea of Galilee and take the coin out of its mouth. And he uses that to pay the temple tax. So they agreed that they would pay for that. Now that was to provide for all the needs for the ongoing daily sacrificial use of the temple, grain offerings, bread to set out on the table, the new moon festivals, all of that stuff. That's what the shekel, the 1/3 shekel, would go to pay for all of that. Now, continue on, verse 34.
We, the priests, the Levites, and the people, have cast lots to determine when each of our families is to bring to the house of our God at set times each year a contribution of wood to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. We also assume responsibility for bringing to the house of the Lord each year the first fruits of our crops and of every fruit tree. As it is also written in the law, we will bring the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, of our herds and of our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests ministering there. Moreover, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of our God, to the priests, the first of our ground meal, of our grain offerings, of the fruit of all our trees, and of our new wine and oil. And we will bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all the towns where we work. A priest descended from Aaron is to accompany the Levites when they receive the tithes, and the Levites are to bring 1/10 of the tithes up to the house of our God, to the storerooms of the treasury. The people of Israel, including the Levites, are to bring their contributions of grain, new wine, and oil to the storerooms where the articles for the sanctuary are kept, and where the ministering priest, the gatekeepers, and the singers stay. We will not neglect the house of our God.
Okay, and that's really the summary statement. That's what this is all about. The altar fire was to burn constantly, and so it needed a ready supply of wood. And so the Levites agreed that they would draw names, cast lots to see which family, which household, which community would provide the wood for that period, for that year, that season, whatever, so that there was always a ready supply of wood to be burned on the altar. Verse 36. They assume responsibility for bringing the first fruits, that's 35, and then verse 36 is written, we will bring the firstborn of our sons and our cattle and our herds and our flocks to the house of God, to the priests ministering over them. The law was, the Torah law, going back to the Exodus, that since God saved the people by the 10th plague, that the firstborn of the Egyptians were all killed, and he saved the firstborn of the Israelites, Passover, that from then on, every firstborn, be that male, a firstborn male, be that human or cattle or other livestock, sheep, that one belonged to God. The firstborn son had to be redeemed. You had to do some sort of sacrifice, some sort of offering. Moses and Joseph and Mary did that with Jesus, where they brought him to the temple and offered the necessary sacrifice to redeem him and pay the price to God for them. A firstborn cattle, if it was clean animal without blemish, was usually killed, sacrificed. The other ones were redeemed, a price paid. But that was goes all the way back to the Exodus, and that is a constant reminder of what God did for them in the Exodus. And then the last one is the proper handling of tithes. Every family, every household was expected to tithe. It was not you can tithe if you want to kind of thing. That was what they gave. A tithe is 10%. So if you brought in 100 bushels of wheat, 10 of them went to the temple. If you had 100 sheep, 10 of them belonged to God. They tithed everything. And they promised that they would continue to do that. The tithing would go to the Levites, who were not to have any property, but to live on the donations of the people. The Levites, in turn, would tithe what they received to the priests and give that to them. And so that was so they vowed that they would do all of that as well. So, all right, that's chapter 10. Any questions? Seeing none or hearing none? Overwhelming. Yeah, Adam.
On this Sabbath year where they didn't grow the crops,
Right.
the whole community stopped growing crops, or did they rotate which fields?
No, the whole community, what I understand. And of course, if they were good farmers and good stewards, then they had stored up grain during the 6 years and had something to fall back on for the 7th year.
Yeah.
But that was, and then all debts were paid, were canceled in the 7th year as well. So if you owed me a couple $1,000 for whatever on the 7th year, done, nothing. We're clean. So that was part of the year of Jubilee, the 7th year. Now there was another one. It was called the year of Jubilee, but that was the 50th year. So 7 times 7, and then the 50th. The year of Jubilee was a year of great celebration. On the year of Jubilee, any land that was yours by inheritance came back to you. If you had sold it during that time, it became yours again. Everything reverted back to the way it was. It's sort of like turning your computer on and pushing the reset button. Yeah.
So I always wondered if anyone would buy something in the 48th year, just so you know they're...
You would wonder about that, wouldn't you, Jamie? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what happens, but that was the year of Jubilee. Okay, chapter.
When did this was in 400 some BC?
Yeah, right.
So did they keep all those rules and laws up until the time of Jesus?
As much as they could, yes.
And then what happened after that? I mean, where did the Jewish community lose sight of all that?
Well, part of it changed dramatically when the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. I mean, that just sort of put a kibosh on all of that sacrificial worship. So everything that's in here about, to the temple and so forth goes away. And that's where the role of the rabbi comes out, the teacher of the synagogue. They kept to it as much as they could, but again, obviously, there's no temple to give to. Now they have their synagogues, and they still support that. I don't know if they're expected to tithe to the synagogue or not. I'm not sure. I haven't talked to a local rabbi about that yet.
Interesting.
Yeah. It'd be a good question for a local rabbi to ask.
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 11. Nehemiah, as he builds the wall, and he hasn't dedicated the wall yet, that's coming. But one of the things he needed to do was to populate the city. This is the holy city. This is the city of God. And it needs people to live in it. One of the realities was that as people settled back into the promised land from their exile, they went back to the lands of their inheritance. And very few of them had that inheritance in Jerusalem itself. And so the city kind of stood empty. And Nehemiah couldn't have that. We got to have people in the city. So they devised a plan to populate the city. So go ahead, Linda. You want to read chapter 11? Well, I'll stop you.
Now
you don't read all his names. Now read down to verse 4. We'll go that far.
Now the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring one out of every 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the remaining 9 were to stay in their own towns. The people commended all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. These are the provincial leaders who settled in Jerusalem. Now some Israelites, priests, Levites, temple servants, and descendants of Solomon's servants lived in the towns of Judah, each on his own property in the various towns, while other people from both Judah and Benjamin lived in Jerusalem.
Okay. So how do they do that? Well, they got the people to agree that they would cast lots, and it was a tithe of people. Just like they tithe their gifts, this was a tithe of people. Every 10th family would come and live in the city. Now, I don't know if that was a permanent arrangement or if that rotated. I'm not quite sure on that. But that they went to the holy city while the remaining 9 were to stay in their own towns. The people commended them. They were very proud of those who were willing to do that. They're called volunteers, but they were chosen by lot, so that probably they volunteered to let their name stand in the line, in the drawing. But they went. So if it would be like if everybody here who lived in Wauwatosa, we wanted to populate Brookfield a little more, so every 10th family in Wauwatosa would move to Brookfield. Why, I have no idea, but that would be the idea. Would that be a good thing or not? I'm not sure. Okay. And now, I won't have Linda read all that. Nehemiah is really good on lists. Really likes lists. So the next list are the people who and where they lived. Verses 3 through 19 are the list of the new residents from the descendants of Judah and the descendants of Benjamin, from the priests, from the Levites, and the gatekeepers. They all were the list of people who moved into the city. So they knew exactly who was living there. And now, why don't you pick it up at verse 20.
The rest of the Israelites with the priests and Levites were in all the towns of Judah, each on his own ancestral property. The temple servants lived on the hill of Ophel, and Zihah and Gishpah were in charge of them. The chief officer of the Levites in Jerusalem was Uzzi, son of Bani, son of Hashabiah, the son of Mattaniah, the son of Micah. Uzzi was one of Asaph's descendants, who were the singers responsible for the service of the house of God. The singers were under the king's orders, which regulated their daily activity. Pethahiah, son of Mehizabel, one of the descendants of Zerah, son of Judah, was the king's agent in all affairs relating to the people. As for the villages with their fields, some of the people of Judah lived in Kiriath Arba and its surrounding settlements, in Dibon and its settlements in...
Okay, all right. It's just it lists all the towns around there where people live, and that's good. We don't need to read all that unless you really, really want to know all of that. I'm assuming that that's kind of superfluous information. Okay, that's chapter 11. That's resettling the city. Now we're going to go to chapter 12. Oh, shoot. Just a minute, lost my notes. Thank you. Good thing I have the pages numbered. I have no idea what order they were in. Okay, we did that one already. We can just leave that one on the floor. 21, let's see. That one we can leave on the floor too. Okay, here we go. Okay. We did the chapter 12 starts with another list. Yay, another list. And we won't have you read the list, but it's the list of the priests and various Levitical offices that were hereditary. It was important for them to keep these kinds of lists so that you had proof of one's eligibility to serve as a Levite or as a priest or as a gatekeeper or whatever in the house of God. By these carefully kept records, both the clergy and the lay Israelites could confirm that those who ministered were legitimate and genuinely appointed by God. It was, even in our church, we don't just ordain anybody that just happens to come along and says, yeah, I'll do that. We follow a carefully selected procedure to make sure that they are trained and ready to go. And so this is a procedure that verifies their eligibility according to birth, that they belong as a Levite because they are in the Levite family. Only those from the house of Aaron, for example, can be priests or serve as a high priest. And so you had those various categories. Now let's pick it up at verse 27. This is where it kind of gets interesting. The dedication of the wall around Jerusalem. So pick up verse 27.
At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with the music of cymbals, harps, and lyres. The singers also were brought together from the region around Jerusalem, from the villages of the Nephthatites, from Beth Gilgal, and from the area of Geba and Asmaveth, for the singers had built villages for themselves around Jerusalem. When the priests and Levites had purified themselves ceremonially, they purified the people, the gates, and the wall. I had the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall. I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. One was to proceed on top of the wall to the right toward the dung gate. Hoshea and half the leaders of Judah followed them, along with Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, Jeremiah, as well as some priests with trumpets, and also Zechariah, son of Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Mattaniah, son of Micaiah, the son of Zachar, the son of Asaph, and his associates, Shemaiah, Azarel, Milaliah, Galilai, Mai, Nathaniel, Judah, and Hanani, with musical instruments prescribed by David, the man of God. Ezra, the scribe, led the procession. At the fountain gate, they continued directly up the steps of the city of David on the ascent to the wall and passed above the house of David to the water gate on the east. The second choir proceeded in the opposite direction. I followed them on top of the wall, together with half the people, past the tower of ovens to the broad wall, over the gate of Ephraim, the Jeshinah gate, the fish gate, the tower of Hananel, the tower of the 100, as far as the sheep gate. At the gate of the guard they stopped. The 2 choirs that gave thanks then took their places in the house of God. So did I, together with half the officials, as well as the priests, Elikiam, Messiah, Okay. The choirs sang under the direction of Jezrahiah, and on that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. At that time, men were appointed to be in charge of the storerooms for the contributions, first fruits, and tithes. From the fields around the towns, they were to bring into the storerooms the portions required by the law for the priests and the Levites, for Judah was pleased with the ministering priests and Levites. They performed the service of their God and the service of purification, as did also the singers and gatekeepers, according to the commands of David and his son Solomon. For long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there had been directors for the singers and for the songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. So in the days of Zerubbabel and of Nehemiah, all Israel contributed the daily portions for the singers and gatekeepers. They also set aside the portion for the other Levites, and the Levites set aside the portion for the descendants of Aaron.
Okay, thank you. The procession around the wall. Now you got to understand, the wall was not just like a wall that you would build in your backyard. It was wide, probably 8 feet wide. It was wide enough for a procession to walk on top of. And so Nehemiah organized first of all, he had the Levites consecrate the people and the wall and purify it. And that marked Jerusalem as the holy city, as a city dedicated to the worship of God. Jerusalem is that unique city where the temple is. It's the holy city of God. Then he formed 2 processions, one going opposite directions, and they started on the southern end of the wall and worked their way. Remember, the wall is this long thumb-shaped city, and they came around both sides and processed up, playing trumpets and singing and so forth, until they met on the north end, and that's where the temple is. And so they stopped there, and then they celebrated where the temple was. And then verse 44 and following talks about how there were storerooms appointed for the places to store the various tithes and offerings that the people gave. And people were in charge of these storerooms, and they performed the services of God, and they had the resources necessary to do that. Also, all down through the time, from the time of David to the time of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah, the daily portions for the singers was given and set aside for them, and they were taken care of. And so here the work of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah are connected. So you get the idea how the dedication was. It was just a grand day where they gathered on the top of the wall and marched around. Sang their hymns and played their trumpets and celebrated to dedicate the wall that they had built in 50-some days. Now it was done. Comments, questions? Yes?
This Asaph that is mentioned a couple of times, is that the Asaph that shows up in the Psalms when, the little blurb at the top of Psalms that talks about, like, Psalm of David?
Yes, if it's connected with David. Yeah, if it's connected with David and Asaph, he was another psalm writer. Right.
And when you see Asaph,
Right, yeah. I'm pretty sure that's the same Asaph. Yes, Jack.
I like the last line in that group of verses, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away.
Yeah.
It says something about today, too. I mean, when worship is really good and great, a lot of people recognize it, they hear it.
Right.
And we should remember that.
Yes, we should.
When we had church out on the front lawn.
Yeah.
The joy of worshiping was heard by many.
Right. Yeah, and that's a witness, definite witness.
Yeah.
Okay, other comments? Well, I didn't think we would finish this, but I think we'll make it. Chapter 13. Chapter 13 has some final reforms that Nehemiah carries out. Somewhere along the way, from the dedication to the temple of the wall to where chapter 13 takes place, Nehemiah went back to Susa, reported back to the king, and he seems like he got permission to come back to Jerusalem again. And when he came back, the solemn agreement that they had signed back in chapter 11, it is kind of struggling. They're not keeping it real well. And so he needs to shape it up a little bit. And so let's read the final reforms of Nehemiah. Let's start with verse 1 and go down to verse 3.
On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent.
Okay, that seems harsh, but you got to know the history of the relationship between Israel and the Ammonites and the Moabites. When Israel was coming up from the wilderness and moving in to settle in the promised land, they came up on the west side, the east side of the Jordan, where the countries of Moab and Ammon were. And they asked the kings of Moab and Ammon, Sihon and Og, by the way, that's their names, asked him if they could just simply travel through on the highway. They wouldn't bother anybody, just let us go through. Well, the king said, nah, I don't think so, because they didn't want this big nation moving in on their front door. So in order to stop them, they hired Balaam. You know the story of Balaam and his donkey. They hired Balaam, a prophet of ill repute, to curse Israel so that they would not be successful in their venture. And Balaam rode his donkey in order to curse Israel, and the donkey kept rubbing up against the side of the wall, the mountain wall, on the path, and hurting his leg. And he beat on the donkey, and he kept trying to get to head. Finally, the donkey says, "Why are you hitting me?" To which I'm sure Balaam went, "Hello?" Because you're not listening to me. Don't you see what's in front of us? And there was an angel there that Balaam finally saw. And so Balaam rendered his curse, but God turned it into a blessing, much to the dismay of the kings of Moab and Ammon. Balaam blessed them instead of cursed them. Because of that whole incident, the people of Israel were constant enemies of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Now that's interesting, because if you look at the history of Israel, does anybody know of a prominent Moabite citizen in the history of Israel? Ruth. She's a Moabitess who becomes the grandmother of King David. So there is this constant animosity, but there are always exceptions to this, where God picks the people he wants regardless of who they are. But at this point, this juncture, Nehemiah says, no, they cannot be a part of the community of Israel. Their influence is bad. They're going to lead our people astray. So get rid of them. And so the people said, oh, okay, we'll get rid of them. Not sure it was all that simple, but nonetheless, that's what was done. The second reform was cleansing the temple. Remember chapter 10 or chapter 12 talked about these storehouses in the temple. Well, one of those became a point of contention. Read on verse 4.
Before this, Eliashib, the priest had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and oil prescribed for the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil that Elisha had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and singers responsible for the service.
Okay, we'll deal with that one next. That's the third one. Let's deal with that later. The storehouses were good, and now while Nehemiah is back in Persia visiting the king, this priest by the name of Eliashib is the relative, I think he's the father-in-law or of Tobiah's daughter, anyhow. He's connected to Tobiah. You remember Sanballat and Tobiah back in the early part of this whole story when they tried to stop the people of Zerubbabel from rebuilding and so forth? Well, they're still around. He's an Ammonite, actually. And somehow he wheels his way into it and gets a storeroom in the temple to put his stuff in. And people seem to somehow like this guy. I don't know why, but they did. Well, when Nehemiah gets back and he discovers that Tobiah has a storeroom in the temple, he kind of goes nuts. The one thing about Nehemiah's leadership, and you see it through this chapter especially in other places, when he deals with an issue, he doesn't mince around it. He confronts the issue directly head on to the people who are most responsible for it. So many times when I've dealt with people over the years, when they have a problem, they don't confront the problem head on. They talk about it to their friends and their neighbors and back there and so forth, and it never ever really gets solved because no one ever confronts the issue. Well, Nehemiah is a good leader. He knows that the best way to solve a problem is to go right up to the guy and say, "No, you're not doing this." So he goes to Eliashib and he says, "No, you're not doing this." He gave orders to clean out the storeroom, toss the stuff out in the street, and he cleansed the storeroom and gave orders to purify it and put back the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. Put back in there what was supposed to be in there. Get rid of Tobiah. Very seems abrupt, but that's the way Nehemiah dealt with things. You're not doing that anymore. And he gets away with it because he is such a forceful leader. Okay, let's do the next section, 10.
I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and singers responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, "Why is the house of God neglected?" Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and oil into the storerooms. I put Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan son of Zachar, son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because these men were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their brothers. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services.
Okay, that far. This is an ongoing issue, it seems like. They had this solemn agreement that they said they were going to provide all the necessary things for the temple and all the grain and the tithes and all that stuff, but they didn't seem to do it. They kind of got lost. And the Levites, who were not supposed to own land, had to go out and get fields and grow their own crops to provide for themselves because they weren't getting anything given to the temple. And Nehemiah says, "Whoa, what is this? Why are the house of God neglected? Why is this going on? This isn't what you agreed to." And so they they stopped and they did, okay, we'll do what we do. And so they brought their tithes of grain and wine to the storerooms. And then verse 13, one of the interesting ways of dealing with a problem, when you have one person in charge. I was called to a congregation many years ago, and they had, when I got there, they said, well, when you take the call, you can deal with Mr. So-and-so. Well, Mr. So-and-so had the congregation by the throat. He was the chairman of the board of stewardship. He had adopted a policy that nothing could be spent over $50 without his approval, and nobody liked him. And I said, well, why is he the chairman of the board? And he said, well, he volunteered. And I said, well, say no. So what does Nehemiah do? He had Eliashib, the head of the storehouses, fires Eliashib, and he appoints a committee. That's always the best way, appoint a committee. And so he appoints Shelemiah and Zedek and Pedallah and Hannah and Zechar, and they were the committee now in charge of the storerooms. The advantage of a committee is it's harder to corrupt them, because you got to do the whole business instead of just one person. So he appoints the committee to oversee the storerooms and make sure they're being handled well. And then verse 14, he offers this interesting little prayer. And the prayer it sounds self-serving. Remember me for this, oh my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God in its services. It sounds like he's self-serving, but it's not. What he's asking is for God to keep what he has started, to keep it going. Keep these reforms that I have put in place, keep them moving. Don't let them stop. And so that's his prayer. Again, Nehemiah has always got God right by his side, and so he offers these short prayers. Now verse 15. Let's just do that next section there.
In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise, and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your forefathers do the same things, so that our God brought all this calamity upon us and upon this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem, but I warned them and said, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, O my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love.
Okay. Keeping the Sabbath holy was crucial to them. And the problem that Nehemiah found as he came back from his visit to Susa was that the people were not keeping the Sabbath. They were selling their wares, their wine, their fish, their things inside the city on the Sabbath day. Now they were influenced by the people from Tyre, non-Jews, who wanted to do that. That's how they made their wealth. And sort of competition, well, if they're going to do it, we're going to have to do it too. So he said, no, you're not going to do that. You're not going to sell your stuff on the Sabbath day. Shut it down. And so he did. And so on Friday evening, at the beginning of the Sabbath, he closed the gates. You know, no traffic in and out. We're no buying and selling going on. The gates are shut. Well, the Sabbath laws obviously didn't apply to the people of Tyre, but they wanted to sell, so they camped right outside the gates so that they would be first in line when the gate opened again. Nehemiah said, no, that's not what we're going to do. he confronts them, chases them away, threatens to arrest them, finally gets the area cleared, and gets the buying and the selling on the Sabbath stopped. He reminds them that that's how Israel got into such trouble years before. That didn't our forefathers do the same thing so that our God brought this calamity upon us and upon the city? Don't do this. And so he got them to agree, and he set Levites as guards against the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day. They were not going to violate the Sabbath anymore. So he closed the gates, set guards, and threatened to arrest those who set up shop outside the gates. So that's how he dealt with the Sabbath. Now there's one more issue. An issue that Ezra dealt with, and it seems to keep popping up. Let's go at verse 23. Why don't you read 23 to the end of the book?
Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath of God's name and said, "You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves." Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel, but even he was led into sin by the foreign women. Must we now hear that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness, and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Joadah, son of Elishib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite, and I drove him away from me. Remember them, O God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provision for the contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. Remember me with favor, O my God.
Okay. In a marriage, it keeps coming up. There were foreign women. The same problem that Ezra dealt with now confronts Nehemiah. And you could say, well, why wasn't it dealt? Well, that was a generation before. You got a new generation of young, healthy young men who want wives. And so they will go looking for where they can get them. And he has to put a stop to it again. He's pretty forceful about it. He rebuked them, called down curses, beat some of the men, pulled out their hair. This wasn't a mild discussion. And he made them take an oath that they would not do that anymore. Not give their daughters in marriage to their sons, or your sons to their daughters, and take them to yourself. Just simply don't do that. And he reminds them of Solomon. If you remember the story of Solomon, Solomon was the wisest man on the earth until he got too many wives. No, I'm not going to go there. Solomon started marrying foreign women. They were politically advantaged marriages. Probably the worst one was to the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. And they continually corrupted Solomon and the court into worshiping idols until finally Solomon didn't know God from an idol, and his son followed him. So you remember that? Well, the wickedness that came on us from that, it would happen again. So don't do this. And there was one, even the son of Eliashib, remember him, the high priest? He was the son-in-law to Sanballat, the Horonite. That guy shows up again. And so he excommunicated him, threw him out, and gets them to agree not to marry again. Then verse 29, another one of his prayers, remember them, O my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. Remember them, don't let them succeed. They didn't do their job, they defiled the priestly office, put them outside. So he purified the priests and Levites, assigned them their duties, made provisions for the contributions of wood and designated times. In other words, he reinstated that agreement that they had, and then simply ends with, remember me with favor, oh my God. Not a bad prayer, anytime, any day. God, do you remember me with favor, for I seek to serve you. Let me just read this last couple of sentences from my notes. In all of this, Nehemiah proved to be an extraordinary leader, a dedicated layman whose work was vital to the preservation of the gospel among God's people. Nehemiah stands as an example for all Christian laity, just as Ezra stands as an example for all Christian clergy. That's the two books. Ezra the priest, Nehemiah the layman, zealously carrying out the will of the Lord for the good of their people. And that's why I wanted to study these two books, because they're such a vital lesson in how to be a leader among God's people, serving Him. Comments or questions? Yes?
In that part where they said the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes,
Right.
he went to see the king.
Right.
After some time, do we know how long?
It would have been a couple of years at least. It takes 4 or 5 months just to get there.
So in the 20th year is when he started all the reforms, and then the 32nd year went back to the
Right.
king. That's 12 years.
Yeah, that's 12. Yeah, about 12. You're right. About 12 years he was governor, and then went back, probably to be reappointed, and then went back. We aren't told whether he was summoned back or he wanted to go back and report. Probably the latter, and then kind of get confirmation of his ongoing position as governor. Okay. Well, I hope this was interesting for you. I enjoyed digging into it. Where do we go from here? I've been doing a lot of thinking and praying about what our next topic might be. And as I thought, well, we need to go back into the New Testament. And as I looked at the books of the New Testament, the ones we've done and the ones we haven't done, I discovered we've done the Gospel of Matthew, we've done the Gospel of Mark, we've done the Gospel of Luke, but we've never done the Gospel of John. And so I would like to do the Gospel of John, beginning in 2 weeks. You're welcome to read ahead. But we'll dive into John's Gospel. John's Gospel is uniquely different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He tells the same story, but in an entirely different way, and he has a unique purpose in his Gospel. It is probably one of the most basic books of the Bible. If people want to be introduced to the Bible, I usually recommend start with the Gospel of John. It's the simplest, straightforward book of the Bible. When we were learning Greek back in college, the first scripture we read was John, because it was the most simple, straightforward Greek. Paul is, he's convoluted. His Greek gets all crazy. He doesn't know how to put a period in a sentence. But John is very straightforward, very simple, and so we would read John. So that's what I'd like to do. Is that all right with everyone? I hope so. So we will begin a study of the Gospel of John in December, the first Thursday of December. What is that, the 5th, I think? December 5th. Yes. So next week we can go stuff ourselves with turkey and whatever else you do on Thanksgiving Day, and then we'll come back. Yes, Jack, you had a question.
You know, the connection between John, the gospel writer,
Yeah,
and John, the 3 books that he had,
right.
the timeline difference. Is there a difference in timeline? Is there?
Yeah, there is.
I mean, that'd be interesting to.
I'll pursue that in my introduction.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll dig into a little bit of that. John wrote the most, other than Paul, he wrote most books of the New Testament, 5 of them. His gospel, 3 letters in the book of Revelation. So, but I'll try and put a timeline on those.
Revelation always is, you know, from God down to John.
Right,
And he recorded it.
right,
But the 3 books of John are really his own writing.
right.
As it
Right.
relates to the gospel. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments? Well, thank you for braving the weather and being here. I'm grateful. Let's just end with a brief prayer. Good and gracious God, thank you for your blessing upon us today. Bring us safely home and enable us to always serve you in all that we do. Bless us in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all. We'll see you next Thursday at church. Thanks, maybe, or at least in 2 weeks.